Hello YouTube. So, in my last video, I talked about Child regarding if I think he is overrated or not, and if I think he is a character you should pull. Today, I want to talk about ZHONGLI, and what I think about his current status in the meta. Is he overrated, underrated, properly rated? What teams is he ideal in, and is he a character you should pull? These are questions I will try to answer in this video. But first, if you wouldn't mind, please be sure to subscribe to this channel. I put a lot of work into theory crafting, so any and all support is greatly appreciated. With that said, let's jump right into this. Okay, so ZHONGLI is a peculiar case. The theory crafting sides of the Genshin community, I see relatively negative opinions of ZHONGLI. This primarily consists of claims that using ZHONGLI on your team is a DPS loss, or that nowadays we have shielders that are better than him and teams that want this shielder. But are these claims any true? I think there is some truth, as well as some missing context to these claims. Firstly, whether ZHONGLI is a DPS loss depends specifically on the exact team. ZHONGLI is an extremely universal character due to his Geo element not interfering much, if at all, with reactions. His resistant shred being something that any team can benefit from. Because of how universally usable he is, it would take me literally all day to go over how optimal he is in all of the teams he can be used in, but I will try to cover a reasonable amount of teams that makes sense to talk about for him, and give my thoughts on how worth it he is in those teams. Firstly, I want to talk about ZHONGLI and Dendro teams. Quick Bloom teams such as Sino and Alhaitham can benefit fairly well from ZHONGLI, but he isn't optimal here even from the perspective of wanting to use a shielder. This is because Quick Bloom teams benefit greatly from going double Dendro. If you use ZHONGLI in Quick Bloom, there is no reason for a second Dendro. Baizu is the shielder that you want in these teams. He has that utility of being the second Dendro and provides some decent buffing of his own. The only downside of Baizu is that against aggressive enemies, you may find that they break his shield, then hit you again before he can create a new one, thus causing you to get interrupted. However, you can mitigate this by just using Xingqiu as your Hydro instead of Yelan, and with Sino specifically, Xingqiu is higher DPS than using Yelan anyway. And in pure Hyperbloom teams, ZHONGLI can be a solid 4th slot, however, Kuki can be used for Hyperbloom, and if she is, the team already has a healer, so there's no need to use a shielder as well, unless you are worried about getting interrupted. But even if you are worried about getting interrupted, Xingqiu is very likely already being used anyway, and Baizu can even be used excellently as a driver for a team like Double Hydro Hyperbloom and provide his shielding. As for quicken teams like Aggravate, Yai, and Keqing, you would rather use Kirara or Baizu, since they provide shielding and the Dendro application needed for quicken. For Aggravate, Sino, and Spread Alhaitham, I would say ZHONGLI is actually pretty solid if you find yourself needing a shielder with them. Sino already has Nahida for Dendro, and the benefit of double Dendro for him is much less in Aggravate. Alhaitham is likely already using Nahida anyway, and there's no real benefit to going triple Dendro. However, I would say that both of these teams can use Baizu to potentially greater effect still anyway. Specifically with Alhaitham, running Baizu can consolidate the role of Dendro and shielder healer, assuming you use him instead of Nahida. This lets you do things like running Sucrose or Kazuha for grouping plus buffing Yai to do a lot more damage. This is something ZHONGLI wouldn't enable you to do since you would have no source of off-field Dendro application for Yai. So when it comes to Dendro teams, ZHONGLI can be decent with Sino and Alhaitham, but I wouldn't recommend it over the other options they have available. Now, I also have a list of 7 different teams that I took a look at and mathematically analyzed ZHONGLI with, and compared him to other options for those teams. So let's take a look at that. First, Ganyu Melt. So Ganyu has to spend up to 2.5 seconds charging for her charged shots, and since she is ranged, she has a very little interruption resistance while doing this. If you get interrupted while charging, you are going to have to start that charge all over again, resulting in a massive DPS loss. This makes it extremely impractical to use her without a shield. Her team, that being Ganyu, Bennett, Zhongli, plus a 4th slot, has no resistant shred for her, so ZHONGLI's universal shred is very valuable here, and he can also buff with tenacity. The other possible shield options for her are Layla, Diona, and Xinyan. Layla has a very strong shield, although not quite as strong as ZHONGLI. It has decent buffing between her C4 and 4-piece tenacity. Layla is also a much more reliable wielder of 4-piece tenacity than ZHONGLI, since his pillars can often miss enemies. So she could be closer to ZHONGLI in practice than what is shown in my calcs. Part of her value also comes from the fact that at C6, she does surprisingly okay damage for someone providing such a strong shield. It's not much and definitely low for sub DPS standards, but she isn't a sub DPS to begin with, so the roughly 4k personal DPS that she provides is pretty solid for her role and contributes to her value. Layla is also able to use Freedom Sworn to buff Ganyu further, which, as we can see, would put her over ZHONGLI. But even without Freedom Sworn, she is only 5% behind ZHONGLI here. However, with that, I should mention that my calcs here have Ganyu on the first grade magic as her weapon, which is giving her an extra 16% attack with Layla and Diona. If you are using any other weapon, the margins would be in ZHONGLI's favor more than what is shown here. Diona is a viable option for Ganyu because at C6 she buffs EM by 200. However, it is not enough to make her comparable to ZHONGLI. She can use Elegy, but even then she's still like 7% behind. And Xinyan is a viable alternative because she can buff with the Tenacity set, and she also lowers ZHONGLI's energy requirements by a pretty good amount. But she's still about 14% behind ZHONGLI despite this. One of the main things causing ZHONGLI to be so much better than the alternative shield options here is his shield lasts much longer, so you can use him at the start of the rotation, and still shield Ganyu for her entire field time. Layla, Xinyan, and Diona's shields all last only 12 seconds, so you have to use them right before Ganyu to have good uptime with them. This results in one less Ganyu charge shot getting Bennett's buff. So, with that explained, I would definitely say that ZHONGLI is truly optimal with Ganyu and the best in slot on her team. The only exception to that is Layla if you have her on Freedom Sworn, but even then, if you're not using Ganyu on the first grade magic, the margin between her and ZHONGLI would be a lot closer. Next, let's talk about Hu Tao. Hu Tao doesn't have much need for being shielded since she has an interruption resistance buff of her own, and gets more from Xingqiu as well. However, Hu Tao does not have many great buffer options for her 4th slot. ZHONGLI works great because of his resistance shirt being able to enhance the damage of Hu Tao, Xingqiu, and Yelan all at the same time. You can also use 4-piece Archaic Petra to buff Yelan and Xingqiu further. Just keep in mind, however, that the Petra set can be rather clunky and awkward to use, but the damage is worth it in this team. For alternative 4th slots to compare to in a Hu Tao double Hydro team, I have Kazuha and Thoma listed. Kazuha is good because he provides grouping plus excellent buffing for Xingqiu and Yelan. Thoma is okay because you will get Pyro Resonance plus his C-Sucks buff and somewhat decent damage from him as well, but it is quite significantly behind using ZHONGLI. Kazuha is much closer, but his grouping is honestly not that great for Hu Tao anyway, since she doesn't have much AoE to take advantage of his grouping to begin with. He will, however, result in more damage than ZHONGLI if you have Freedom Sworn, but the margin is extremely negligible. Of course, this would jump up massively if you have C2 Kazuha though. So with Hu Tao, I would say I think ZHONGLI is definitely optimal. You might be wondering why I didn't compare to VV Vape Hu Tao. That is because I don't believe VV Vape Hu Tao is a good team. Its rotations are awful and the team is incredibly impractical for various reasons, but I won't ramble on with that as that would take this video too off topic. Then we have Itto. ZHONGLI is great with Itto. His resistant trait is a good increase to the team's damage, he can hold tenacity, and he makes off-field geoparticles to help with Itto's energy requirements. His long shield uptime also lets you use him at the start of the rotation, and still have Itto shielded for his entire field time. You absolutely have to have shielding with Itto, because the damage bonus and resistance shard effects of Geo-Resonance only apply while you are shielded. The only shielders that I would say are viable alternatives to ZHONGLI here are Layla and Xinyan. However, they are pretty far behind, and their shields also don't last Itto's entire field time. Thus, you'd have to rely on Crystallize while their shields are down, which may not be very practical. I have also heard of people using Yelan instead of Zhongli and relying on the crystallized shields you will get for maintaining shielding. You won't get many Yelan burst procs here since Ito spends a lot of time charged attacking, so for this calc I assumed she only gets 7. Because of this, a lot of her value is coming from her damage bonus buff, which is pretty nice for Ito since he has a massive attack buff and not that much damage bonus in his kit. As we can see, this does make Yelan about a 5% increase over Zhongli. However, I personally would not recommend doing this, because if you aren't shielding, you lose a lot of damage here, and I do not believe crystallizers are not reliable enough to make this worth it. So, in my opinion, Zhongli is fully optimal and the best in slot on an Ito team. We also have the newest addition to the roster, Linny. Linny is a charged shot bow DPS, so he has the same issue as Ganyu with charging time and little to no interruption resistance, thus making him extremely impractical to play without a shield. I have many different team options calculated for Linny, so I'm not going to explain them all in detail. Please watch my Linny TC analysis video for that, as I went over all of them in that video. But here we can see that for playing Linny with a shield, the highest DPS team options to use Zhongli. Lynette can be used for higher DPS and that as a means of protection with her taunt, but her taunt doesn't work against bosses. We can also see that you do get significantly more DPS if you drop using a shielder altogether for Linny. This is once again extremely impractical, and I don't believe most people are going to get good value out of trying to force shieldless Linny. So, Linny is yet another character I would say Zhongli is fully optimal with. Following Linny, we have Wanderer. Wanderer has no interruption resistance at all due to flying, because when mid-air, characters have no interruption resistance, and this applies to Wanderer for his entire skill duration. Now I personally don't believe Wanderer needs a shield regardless, because he is extremely mobile and gets free dodges with his Ascension 4 passive. He can even fly higher by pressing the jump button in exchange for some field time, and if he does this, very few enemies will be able to hit him at all. But a lot of people still prefer to play him with a shielder because it makes him so much easier and more comfortable to use. And this is perfectly fine because his best shield options are actually pretty competent with his buffers and sub DPS options. So let's take a look at the numbers and see how Zhongli stacks up. I have a very long list of 4th options here because Wanderer's 4th slot is extremely flexible. Unfortunately, Zhongli is near the bottom of this list. This is because his resistance shred and buffing with tenacity has diminished value with Wanderer, since Farazan already provides both of these things. Even if you refuse to play Wanderer without a shield, there are much stronger options for shielding like Layla, Thoma, and Dia. Layla provides 20% crit rate from being cryo plus her C4 buffing. Dia provides Pyro Resonance and some small attack buffing with the Aquamarine Claymore. And Thoma provides Pyro Resonance and 15% damage bonus from his C6. What these 3 provide is much more valuable than Zhongli, so unfortunately, Wanderer is a team in which I would say Zhongli is definitely not optimal in. Now let's talk about Zhao. Zhao very commonly uses a shielder because when he is jumping and in the air, he has mid-air poise just like Wanderer, so basically anything that hits him would interrupt him, and he would have to start to jump all over again. He does, however, get what I believe is infinite interruption resistance as soon as you press the plunge button. This goes away as soon as he hits the ground. And Zhao also has no mobility or room to dodge since you are standing in place plunging. This can make it very valuable to run him with a shielder. But the other reason why he is commonly used with a shielder is because there aren't many other options for him to begin with. He doesn't work very well with many buffers other than Faruzan and Bennett, but they are already on the team. And he doesn't work very well with many sub-DPS either, aside from Zhongli and Lynette. But from this list, we can see that Zhongli is behind most of the other options for Zhao, even the other shielder, Thoma. However, when it comes to Zhongli versus Thoma for Zhao, we have to keep in mind that Zhao spends a lot of time plunging, so you may not get enough opportunity to stack Thoma's shield, and thus you might still get interrupted anyway. But if you don't find that to be an issue, then Thoma is definitely better as long as he's at C6, because just like with Wanderer, Faruzan already provides resistant shred and tenacity buffing. And if you are able to play Zhao without a shielder without any issues, then you will get much more value out of using Lynette for the 4th slot for her damage and battery. She does really good damage without taking any Bennett buff uptime, and she makes 8 Anemo particles at C4. Or against bosses with big enough hitboxes, ZHONGLI gets in extra Pyronado hits, so you may want to use her there. Though I would still recommend Lynette because she's probably going to be better for the full floor compared to ZHONGLI, likely only being better for a single chamber. So with Zhao, I wouldn't say that ZHONGLI is necessarily optimal with him, but he is still a very competent pick, assuming you find Zhao hard to play without a shield. Lastly, I have Yoimiya. Yoimiya is a character that benefits greatly from using a shielder. She is ranged, so she has pretty low interruption resistance. And in Vaporize teams, you really want to perform her full in-5 combo to Vaporize her in-3 and in-5, as those are her two biggest hits. If you either dodge or get interrupted before getting there, you're going to have to start the combo all over again. Depending on the specific hit which your combo got interrupted at, this may completely throw off which hits Vaporize, resulting in even further DPS lost. But, as we can see, ZHONGLI is the highest DPS shield option for Yoimiya. His resistance shred is highly valued since there is no other source of it here. And since Yoimiya also uses Yunjin, you get Geo-Resonance, enhancing his value even further. The next highest DPS shield option for her is Layla, because her cryo application will let you get in some melts in addition to your Vaporizes. However, I would not recommend using Layla with Yoimiya at all, despite what the numbers say. This is because bosses cannot be frozen, and against enemies that can't be frozen, the cryo application will just remove the hydro, resulting in Layla stealing Vaporize and not providing melt in return, which is why the no freeze calc here is so low. Yoimiya is a single target DPS, so using her against bosses is going to be her ideal scenario most of the time, and making her ideal scenario so much worse is just counterproductive. Then the only other good option for this is Thoma, but he falls very behind ZHONGLI with Yoimiya. This is because Yoimiya wants to do 18-second rotations, since Yelan is the highest cooldown on the team, and the field requirements of Yoimiya and her supports lines up very well for 18-second rotations. But Thoma's burst cooldown ruins that because it forces you to do a 20-second rotation at minimum, which results in a massive DPS loss. So I would absolutely say that ZHONGLI is fully optimal and the best in slot with Yoimiya, unless you're skilled enough to play her without a shield. Okay, that was a lot of math to analyze. To summarize, I think ZHONGLI is best in slot with Hu Tao, Linny, Ito, Ganyu, and Yoimiya, and can be with Zhao if you find yourself getting interrupted on him without a shielder, although he faces stiff competition with Thoma there. There are probably other teams you could argue for him to be the best in or highly competitive in, but these are the 7 that I could think of. If you can think of any more, please let me know in the comments down below. I'd be very curious to know what you think. There is another important thing regarding ZHONGLI's value compared to alternative options that I haven't mentioned yet, and that is, his value in a lot of teams goes up significantly in a lot of teams if facing enemies with high resistance. As I mentioned, with Wanderer and Zhao, part of the reason ZHONGLI's value is lower with them is because Farazan already provides 30% resistance shred. This will put most enemies' resistance into the negatives, and any resistance shred applied below 0 has its effectiveness halved. This makes ZHONGLI's 20% shred increase your damage by 10% compared to the 20% that it would if the enemy's resistance wasn't negative. But if you are facing enemies with high enough resistance to not fall negative even with the shred your team already has, ZHONGLI can get the full value of his shred. As an example of how much this increases ZHONGLI's value, it makes him the highest DPS shield option for Wanderer, slightly ahead of Layla, and the highest overall 4th slot for Zhao, even above Lynette. This is something I don't really ever see anyone mention. I believe it is very important to keep this in mind with ZHONGLI, since enemies with high resistances aren't uncommon in the Abyss. For example, the Consecrated Beasts have 40% resistance to everything, and 70% to the corresponding element. Whopper Flowers have 30% resistance to everything, and 75% to the corresponding element. The Crab Boss in the current Abyss has 70% resistance to everything while shielded, and 120% to Pyro. Even after the shield breaks, it still has 60% pyro resistance. And the Icewind suit currently on Chamber 3 of Floor 12 has 70% resistance to both Cryo and Anemo. So, with all that said, what do I think of ZHONGLI? Is he overrated? Underrated? And do I think you should pull for him? If anything, I think I would say he tends to be a bit underrated by people in the Theorycrafting sides of the community. The claims about him being a DPS loss aren't completely unfounded, but that depends heavily on the team. And the claims about him being a DPS loss I think are also a bit silly if it's a team where ZHONGLI isn't far behind non-shield options. Getting interrupted is a DPS loss, dodging is a DPS loss, dying is a DPS loss. So I really think the DPS loss claims only hold weight if ZHONGLI is also being outclassed by other shielders, or options to provide good interruption resistance, or if he is far enough behind other team options for him to not be worth even if you are consistently getting staggered. And while it is true that he gets beat by other shielders in some specific teams and scenarios, none of the other shielders are universal like he is. He is the only shielder in the game that has his combination of high uptime, not requiring normal attacks or anything like that to function, a universal buff that any team can benefit from, and having a neutral element to allow him to fit into almost any type of team. This also gives him excellent future value since any new unit that would want to shield is more than likely going to get good use out of him. So if you are looking to build just one really good shielder that you can use just about anywhere, anytime you feel like you need a shield, ZHONGLI is the only character in the game that will truly be able to do this for you for just about any team. This can save you resin compared to building up so many different shielders for a bunch of different specific teams and scenarios, and even save you primo gems by not needing to pull for any other shielders, since not everyone has things like C6 Thoma or Layla or Baju lying around to use already. Therefore, if you are considering pulling ZHONGLI, I say go for it. I believe pretty much anyone can pull ZHONGLI and get value out of him one way or another. It's pretty hard to go wrong with pulling him, and if you main any of the characters I listed as him being optimal for, then I would definitely recommend going for him if you can. But on the other hand, if you already have several other shielders built up, like Layla, Thoma, Baizu, and Kirara, then I would say you can just skip ZHONGLI and likely not miss out on too much. Unless you're a Yoimiya main, then I'd say you probably should pull him. But yeah, that's about all I have to say. If you liked today's video, please be sure to give it a like and subscribe if you haven't already. And please also be sure to drop a comment letting me know your thoughts below. Thanks. Bye.